maybe tell me a bit about who were you, and what kind of a person were you? What were you doing before you volunteered to go overseas?
Well, back prior to deployment, I joined the reserves in 1989, and I deployed in '93. In that time period, I worked a bunch of construction jobs and had worked for almost a year and a half with as a heavy equipment operator for a mobile gravel crushing company. Finally gave up that as a sort of a dead-end job and went to university. So I went to university at Augustana in Camrose. And I went in as a mature student, which was pretty strange, having had to work for a living. So it was a little weird, and actually I thought it was a bit of a break because you get a lot of free time when you're in university as opposed to when you're working for a living, especially construction type work. So I sort of maybe partied a little too hard in my first year and decided maybe I needed to take some time off and just kind of figure out what I really wanted to do, because it's kind of an expensive proposition if you're not prepared to commit to it. So I went back and ran heavy equipment for a while when word came down through the orderly room that they were looking for augmentees to go over to Yugoslavia. And at that point in time, I'd given up the opportunity to go to Cyprus with the artillery, mainly because I was back and I was working, I was making a decent amount of money, and I didn't really want to give up that employment at that time. But it was getting into the fall season, things were getting colder, and I'm like, do I really want to work in northern Alberta all winter, or do I want to do something different? I mean, it's not like I was really locked into anything. And so I figured, what the heck, I'll put my name in and I'll go do some of the pre-selection training, and I don't have to commit to anything until the future sometime, so I'll give it a go and see what happens. That was pretty much how I ended up deciding to go. And I had watched quite a bit of the news, watched quite a bit of the issues that were going on back in '91, '92 over in the former Republic Yugoslavia. So I kind of had a fairly, at least what I thought at the time, was a fairly decent understanding of what the heck was going on.
What do you recall from those newscasts? For somebody that maybe is watching this as too young, didn't see that. What was in the news at the time?
Well, I mean, one of the things I do remember was the stuff that was going on in Sarajevo. Quite a bit of fighting in there. The former Olympic city being shot up and bombed. And one thing that sort of highlights, that stands out to me, and it's maybe just because it was so, in certain respects was almost comical in a black sort of way, was the Maslenica Bridge, that they would rebuild it and then it would get blown up and they'd rebuild it the next week, and this went on for a fair amount of time, and it was just something that was bizarre, or for the average person, sort of bizarre that they would go to that lengths and wouldn't find a different route if they couldn't. So I mean, those sort of stand out, and there was no, at that point in time, there was no real talk of anything like ethnic cleansing, or it was a war. It was a civil war, and that, and all that entails. I mean, at that point in time in university, I was actually was working towards a degree in biology. Subsequent to my deployment, I actually went back to university and changed it to political science, because that was a heck of a lot more interesting. So I mean, and that's sort of what sticks out in my mind, what I remember, seeing the news clips, that 30-second sound bite of a bunch of armored vehicles driving down a road with some blown up buildings behind it. That's pretty much what I remember from the news.
So what did the people close to you think when you told them, I'm going, I'm going to put my name forward or do the selection training to go to Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, some of the people that I'd gone to university with thought I was insane. That figures when you're in a liberal arts university and there's a bunch of, very liberal people there. Though there was quite a few people that supported guys who were in as adult students. A couple of them that I went to school with were retired patricians, done their 4 or 5 year stint in the regular force and then gotten out to pursue other other career aspirations. So I had support there. On the family side of things, it was mixed. Like, my family's always been on both sides. My mother's side, my uncle two of my uncles served in the first Gulf War, and at that point in time, they were both still in the military, and they hadn't gotten out. My one uncle, he retired after 30 years, I believe it was, as a division sergeant major down in Texas, where he still is today. So, you know, I had the support there. Of course, my mother, she didn't want me to go. She didn't even want me to be in the Army, but, you know, I think that's sort of a common thing with anyone's mother. They don't really want you to do that, but overall, I think I had quite a bit of support from my family for my decisions.
So could you boil it down? Is there one thing you were looking for from this experience?
I don't think I was really looking for anything in particular. I mean, it was, you know, I'd been a reservist for 3 years at that point in time, almost 4 years. And, you know, I mean, you do a lot of training, and you do a lot of going out to Wainwright and run around and practice your skill set. And I'm a gunner. I'm in the artillery. So for me, this was sort of not quite stepping out of my comfort zone, but stepping into a zone where I covered briefly in basic training, and really it was a secondary duty in my world, which was you know, the infantry aspect of it. So maybe to a certain extent, I sort of wanted to prove that, you know, I can do that as well. And I thought it would be, you know, at that point in time, I mean, it was, it felt like, you know, why did I get into this? Why did I join the reserves if I'm not prepared to actually go and do stuff like this? I mean, that's kind of sort of why you're joining in the first place. I mean, you're not just joining because they give you some really cool food and give you a really fancy uniform to wear around. So I figured, well, you know, I mean, I'm young. I don't really have, you know, I don't have a family of my own. I don't have anything to hold me down. I can really go in and do this while, you know, it's not going to really cause any contention. So that's probably the main reason. I mean, it's not like, I don't think I was really looking for anything per se.
Tell me about what was your workup training like? What did you do? What kind of stuff? How?
Well, we actually started out here in Calgary and Edmonton running basically pre-selection camps, which was essentially everybody who was interested in going between Edmonton and Calgary. We got together for a 2-week period. The Calgary-based units in Calgary and the Edmonton-based units in Edmonton, and we actually ran a 2 weeks pre-selection camp, which is basically to make sure that you weren't going to get to Winnipeg and die of a heart attack because you were so out of shape, and you at least were competent in the basic skill sets that the battalion was going to require. Which was really interesting because that gave you, at that point in time in my career, I didn't really know a lot of the people in the other units. I mean, you knew a few people, but for the most part, they were complete strangers. So that, you know, gave me sort of a leg up into, you know, getting to know some of the people that I could possibly be on tour with. So it was good in that respect, and it covered just the basic, you know, military skills, basic infantry skills, first aid, fitness, you know, that kind of stuff. And then once we made it through that portion, then our names were submitted, and then in January of '89, we went to Winnipeg to the 2nd Battalion.
89?
Or sorry, 93.
Yeah, want to just start that again?
So then in January of '93, the people that were made it through the pre-selection camp went off to Winnipeg to be with the 2nd Battalion to do their workup training. What I can really say about the workup training in Winnipeg was I actually thought it was very well done. The integration of a large number of reservists within the battalion, I thought went very, very well. You know, you don't see, or maybe most people don't equate military, especially the infantry guys, with being very welcoming. But for the most part, you know, they were, you know, we were treated very fairly. We were treated the same as everyone else. the training was designed for an active combat operation. I mean, we did a lot of the peacekeeping type training as well. Cordon search operations, specialist operations you wouldn't normally see in a full spectrum warfare, full spectrum war fighting. But we did cover all of that, and I felt we did quite a bit of very valuable and effective training that prepared us for what we were going to get into and what we could potentially get into. I think that was the year I did first aid about 4 times. Regular with the unit and a pre-selection, and then I did it with the 2nd Battalion, and then they sent me off to do some training for administering IVs, which was kind of an interesting thing, and thought it was actually quite fun.
You also went to the States, didn't you?
Yeah, we because our training cycle, we started in January of '93 in Winnipeg. We were going to be deployed to Yugoslavia in the summer. Not really a temperate, it would be quite the big temperate change to do all your training in the dead of winter in Manitoba and then go to essentially a hot spot in the Mediterranean or the Adriatic in Yugoslavia. So, and I'm not, honestly, at that time I was a bombardier, so I have no idea who or how they ended up with making the decision that we were going to go do our actual field training as a battalion in Fort Ord, California. So we deployed in, I believe it was February, to Fort Ord, California, just outside of Monterey. And I found out after the fact that 2 or 3 years after we were there, they actually shut that base down. And now it sort of makes sense considering how empty it was when it was supposed to be a base housing an entire division of troops. And that was actually probably the highlight of my pre-training, was being down in Fort Ord. Our austere living conditions out in the training area was, our BIV site was an old, essentially it looked like a stockade, like a cattle stockade. So we had we built our BIVs inside the stockade, and of course, this is Northern California in February. So we're up here, it snows, down there it rains, and it rained a lot. So, I mean, it was almost, I wouldn't say it was as bad as World War I in France with the amount of mud, but we did quite a bit of trenching to try and keep the BIF site dry. It was a very well set up training area, and the training system that they had set up for us and the training plan that they set up for us was very good. We started out basically with pairs training, working all the way up through to company level assaults, and it was. I've never had to do an ammo declaration that long before in my life when we were done that one, but it was quite interesting. And for me, I mean, being an artilleryman, seeing an infantry exercise on that level and training at that level and that scope was, entirely new. I mean, an artillery regiment in the field, an artillery battery out in the field, we don't cover a lot of space when we're deployed, and we're spread out. So, I mean, you could have an entire regiment in the field and, you don't see that many people. When you get an infantry battalion out in the field, you see a lot of people. So for me, that was quite different. And I definitely think that was a very good experience, especially further on in my career.
You said that the 2nd Battalion was pretty welcoming, but in general at that time in the Army, how would you characterize kind of relations between the regular force and the reserve? Like, what had your experience been before that? Well,
my experience before that had been very much us and them. I mean, there was a separation between the low budget MO and the regular force, and we were looked at as the third class citizens of the Army. That had been my experience in all my experience thus far in my career. So to a certain extent, going to Winnipeg, I was like, okay, this could be a complete shit show. Like, I mean, this could be, Do I really want to be a pariah for the next 9 months? That the possibility of that happening, had crossed my mind based on some of my previous experience working with the regular force. But to my, I shouldn't say so much to my surprise, but definitely it was welcomed that we got integrated as quickly as we did within the battalion. So yeah, it was definitely a very good reception that we had.
And what you said, there's a lot of reservists. What do you remember? What the mix was in your particular company?
I would probably say in our company we had probably close to 40%. Just thinking back on even just one platoon, the section layout. I mean, the vast majority of the section members were reservists. For the most part, it seemed that probably the majority of the leadership positions within the sections and the platoon were regular force, but that wasn't always the case. I believe the 3 platoon commander was a reservist. And there were reservists within the company headquarters. I believe our ops officer was a reservist as well. So I don't know, I've heard a bunch of different numbers about what the makeup of the battalion was based on reservists and regular force, but I do think that there was a very large percentage of reservists within the battalion at the time that we deployed. What that actual number is, I honestly couldn't say, but I do know it was significant.
So you'd done all the workup training. What were your expectations? What did you think you were getting into before you actually arrived in Croatia?
Expectations of what we were getting into. I honestly, what I expected and what we actually encountered were very, very similar. Like I'd heard all the stories from guys who'd gone to Cyprus, what the Cyprus life was like, and I didn't expect that. Having watched it on the news of what was going on, and when we got in the area, I actually expected us for it to be a lot more, a lot busier when we first got there than it actually was. So to a certain extent, it didn't. What I expected us to run into didn't, at least not materialize immediately upon our arrival. It was, I didn't expect, there to be mess dinners, and I didn't expect us to, having to count our ammunition, much like people in Cyprus had. I expected it to be, our posture to be a lot more proactive than that, and us to be a lot busier than what it sounds like the Cyprus tours were like. So I don't think my expectations were what actually entailed were very far apart.
What were your first impressions when you hit the ground?
Well, we hit the ground on, I believe I was on the second rotation. We were April 5th is when we actually landed, early April. And my first thought was, okay, so we're in a warm country. It's bloody cold here. It was very rainy. We drew our flak vests and helmets and weapons and our ammunition, and went off. Well, actually, we bussed from Zagreb to Camp Palom, where we drew our helmets and flak vests and weapons. And from there, then we got moved forward to our various company locations and platoon locations. One thing I did notice almost right off after we left Zagreb was the, not so much devastation per se, but you don't normally, when driving through rural Alberta, pass a bunch of machine gun vehicles in the ditch. So that was sort of my first impression of the place traveling was, well, I guess we're in a shooting war, and or at least where one has recently been going on. And then when we actually got into our company area in the town of Pakrac, and saw the location we were going to be living in, 1 Platoon and Company headquarters, which was a bombed out hotel, that, you know, a previous rotation had just put the roof on. So we actually had a roof on it when we got there. It was, well, definitely austere living conditions, but it beats a tent. And then to my surprise, we were actually living in a tent inside the ballroom of the hotel because they didn't quite have all the holes plugged yet. So, I mean, my first impressions of the place, especially the town of Pakrac when we got in there and started doing an orientation to it was, yeah, there was a significant amount of fighting in there. You know, but it was weird, like strange driving through some of the urban areas, some of the projects where you go 2 or 3 houses completely destroyed, like walls down, roof down, hardly anything to tell that it was a house except for a pile of rubble, and then a house that's not touched. Like, it was kind of strange in that regard. I mean, almost like the stories you hear of when the tornado rolls through town, leaves a house perfectly, no damage whatsoever, and everything around it's complete devastation. There was a lot of that, which was, you know, and not just on a small scale. It was the vast majority of the town looked like that. So it was definitely I probably wouldn't be going too far to say it was a surreal experience. You know, the expectations of what I thought was going to happen, what it was going to be like, what I'd seen on the news reports, what I'd read about, you know, a bit of a military history buff, so I'd read quite a bit about First, Second World War, Vietnam, that kind of thing. And you know, kind of being in that type of environment, just like, am I really here? Like, okay, I guess I am. And I think one of the things that really sticks out to me is the scent, the smell. It was the smell of the place. I don't know. I mean, it's like walking through an old ruined building. You know, that kind of must, that mold, rotting garbage, that kind of thing. Definitely a very eclectic number of smells all kind of jammed together, and something that I didn't really have much experience with.
Those smells, do you ever encounter those smells here in Canada? Have a bit of a flashback to that?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely scents are something that really trigger memories. Especially for me, there's certain scents and there's certain types of things that I avoid, just because I don't really like what I associate with those smells. It's better now than it used to be. My first couple of years after coming back were not the greatest when it came to dealing with things. So, yeah. Scents are definitely something that I keep an eye out on.
What was your job? What were you doing sort of an average day or day to day?
Day to day, I was in 2 section, and day to day we either ran the hot dog stand, which was the sort of little guard house outside of the company headquarters building. So basically you track people going in, going out. Keep the locals from wandering in, that kind of thing. Running patrols, sitting on OPs, I don't know, a regular run-of-the-mill kind of thing. Doing, a fair amount of patrolling, and that kind of brings out the one thing that, when it came to being prepared, we were prepared with a lot of the training that we did. But holy cow, we had no maps. We were using Michelin gas station maps to navigate. No grid markers, nothing. And I mean, they were just, it was terrible in that regard, like having maps of the area. It wasn't until we'd been there for 2 months until we actually started getting maps. I mean, they weren't even proper 1 in 50,000 military maps. They were Michelin road maps, which is still better than nothing. But I mean, that kind of thing that we had was, or didn't have, I should say, was kind of surprising to me. But at the time, in hindsight, looking back, at that time, we don't have the technology that we have now, where we'll get a hold of Google Maps and we'll put it into our little computer system and we'll print it out in our big map printer that'll give us custom maps for whatever we want. You know, that type of technology back in the early 90s didn't really exist. So getting maps, well, then you had to order them from whoever made the maps, and then they'd have to ship them to you, and that doesn't happen overnight. And you know, in this type of operation, and I'm pretty sure they didn't have a lot of lead time to know exactly where they were going to end up and what kind of maps or what locations they were going to need. So, I mean, in retrospect, it makes sense as to why we didn't, but a heads up would have been nice. By the way, we're sending you to A, B, and we don't have a map for you. Here's the best we can do. But that was one of the things that kind of stuck out about certain aspects of the tour that were, you know, I thought to be a little bit lacking.
What about the equipment that you had? How would, not looking back at it, but at the time, was it adequate?
At the time, actually, what we had was pretty much frontline Canadian military equipment. I mean, we were using we were mechanized, so we had the 113 carriers with the old Iltis. We had 5/4, deuce and a halves, transport vehicles. You know, when it came to personal weapons, I mean, we were, I believe, the first unit deployed with C7A1s with the C79 sight, which was actually kind of strange because we did all our workup training with the C7s in like 2 weeks before we deployed. Oh yeah, by the way, we're getting a new rifle. We're going to bore sight in the hallways, and then we're going to go to the range the next day to fire them to get you zeroed in. So we did have, you know, at that point in time, we had some brand new kit. We had you know, thermal sights that were basically brand new. So it was a scramble getting people trained on how to operate these things. So overall, I mean, for a infantry battalion, I think we were kitted out as well as we could be, but we didn't, I mean, it wasn't like an integrated battle group. We didn't have artillery support. There was no armored support. It was basically a mech infantry battalion, basically with a mortar platoon, and that was it. So, you know, in the second half of our tour, that was that I think made a big difference in how we deployed and whatnot when we got moved from Sector West to Sector South. You know, essentially when they moved us, and this decision happened actually while I was on mid-tour leave. So I left on our mid-tour leave. You know, we were safely ensconced in Pakrac. The future looked like, when I came back, to being, you know, another 2.5 months of what I'd previously been doing for the last 3 months. And I get back and they're packing up the company areas, going, yeah, we're turning this over to the Argentinian battalion and we're moving. Okay. So that was a little bit of a change of pace for me. And then at that point, we packed up the battalion and started moving down to Sector South. And then we got to Sector South, and you know, from reading some of the stuff after the fact, a few years later when things started coming out in people's personal books and memoirs and whatnot, and things started to become quote unquote history, you know, the political decisions to move the battalion from Sector West down to Sector South, and the issues with getting weapons and equipment down into that area definitely put the battalion, as far as I'm concerned, sort of behind the 8 ball. I mean, we got, you know, basically an unsupported battalion, and then you're taking away a good portion of what we actually have just to move us from point A to point B. that was, in my opinion, probably not the smartest move, but politics is politics, and sometimes that's what happens, and the soldiers end up getting the short end of the stick.
I just maybe need to have you explain, when you say they were taking away some of what you had, what do you mean? What was being taken away?
My understanding is one of the big issues was when we moved to Sector South was getting the TOW missiles down for the TOW under armor unit, the anti-tank platoon. My understanding was they had a lot of issues with actually moving the missiles, mainly because the Serbs thought that we were arming the Croatians, or the Croatians thought we were the army. I don't really understand exactly what the real issues were around that, but I mean, it was us getting, even crossing lines. When we crossed down, going through a checkpoint, rolling into a checkpoint, and you got two T-54 55s, basically in hull down positions watching you, and there's like, you're in a bunch of trucks, and we had, at that point in time, if things had gone sideways, we were screwed, because we would have just been wiped out. So, I mean, getting us from point A to point B was a pretty sticky situation to begin with. And then, once we were down there, setting up, the company, the platoons got split up and spread all over the place, at least within a company. And, 1 and 2 sections were sent out to an OP, and we were, part of our task was to provide observation on the Maslenitsa Bridge. And we were essentially surrounded by Serb forces. We had a T-55 up the road, one 300 meters behind us, and then down on towards the west there was another one. And we were stationed in a platoon house, or in a house that we'd taken over, and just outside of the town of Obervac, which was actually a quaint little European city. It's in town's in the bottom of this ravine with a spire in the center of it with an old wrecked castle on the top of it. But when the stuff happened down in the Medak Pocket, we knew something was going on when the artillery started picking up and the Serbs started machine gunning the side of the mountain to take out the Croatian OPs. And the Croatians were trying to shell into the valley, because the Serbs had a couple of 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that they were using down there, and which kind of proves the point. Blind artillery fire isn't really effective, because I'm pretty sure they shot all day long and they didn't hit anything but a lot of field. And and then the radio traffic picked up, and we didn't really at that point in time really know a lot about what was happening within the battalion, outside of there was a major operation going on. Canadian troops had been under fire, and we were on a high readiness. And then it kind of just petered out without a lot of information as to what actually happened. I mean, I didn't find out really anything happened until when the first group, the first chalk to go back to Canada went out. I got picked as a driver to take the guys from our section who were going back, or from our platoon who were going back. So we drove back to the battalion lines where they were all meeting up to get on the bus, and ran into a buddy of mine from Charlie Company who kind of gave me a quick down and dirty what had happened. And I had really no clue until that time, what all had transpired. And at that point in time, the activity that we'd gone through in September started to make a lot more sense. And so passage of information was fairly, at least down to the lower levels, was fairly minimal at that point in time.
It's not a story that people knew a whole lot about, or even now, right? So what did you think at the time when this guy is telling you about what was happening within your battle group's AO?
I mean, and honestly, at that time, he didn't really mention anything about ethnic cleansing or anything like that. Just that they'd been, sent into an area and come under fire, and they'd been in a fairly substantial firefight. I mean, he was pretty messed up, and he was for years after the fact. But I knew it was something more than just a random incident that had happened, and honestly didn't really find anything significantly more about it until much later on, after, for years after, when I came back. You hear the little grumblings and little rumors, but no facts. And honestly, probably for 10 years, nobody knew anything. Like, the public had no clue. Most people in the Army didn't know anything about it. It was one of those things that happened, and nothing came out about it until much later. And then it was like, holy cow! Surprise! We're not just out here looking great in our blue helmets.
As a soldier who was in that unit, how did that make you feel? The fact that the 2nd Battalion had been some of the companies in the 2nd Battalion had been involved in this fight that just kind of wasn't publicized. Honestly, I didn't really. I don't know. I mean, I think part of it when I got back, I didn't really think at that point in time too much about it. Our return to Canada and integration back into civilian life was, I left Yugoslavia on October 5th. I was in my living room 72 hours later. There was land in Winnipeg, turn in all your kit, basically a couple nights sleep, go over to our old section command or Section 2 IC's house, have a chili supper, and gone. That was it. You got a nice plaque and a picture from the 2nd Battalion, and honestly, how we came back was completely wrong. At that point in time, though, there wasn't really a lot of, I don't think, dealing with operational stress. That wasn't really on the radar, per se, as a factor. I grab water here. A little dry. We actually were probably, I would say, when it comes to operational stress, PTSD, we were actually one of the initial research pilot programs. I do know, prior to deployment, they gave a bunch of us, I'm not sure if it was everybody or if it was just a certain percentage, we got these like half-inch thick booklets full of like literally thousands of questions. And it was part of a PTSD study, which I honestly don't know the outcome of. And when we came back, I can't remember exactly how long it was after I got back. We got sent another booklet, fill that out, and that sort of went on. It was supposed to go on for a couple of years. I did the one when we came back, and I think there was one a year after that I did, and then that was sort of the last I heard about it. So, I mean, looking at how in later deployments, Afghanistan and whatnot, how troops were brought back into the country, brought back into civilian life, brought back into mainstream Canada, obviously were the result of lessons learned that they learned in the early to mid 90s from the tours in Yugoslavia and that sort of stuff. So, in hindsight, like, what the hell are you doing taking a bunch of guys basically out of a combat zone and sending them out, and 72 hours later, oh yeah, by the way, go back to your job at Max, or go back to university and function like a normal human being. It doesn't really happen, which probably explains why my first 2 or 3 years back were definitely not what I would call the most peaceful existence. And honestly, like, I think that really, not just for me, but for quite a few guys who deployed,
that was definitely a serious problem to them.
So what kinds of things, what kind of mood were you in when you came home?
Like in retrospect, I was glad to be back. The first place when I flew into Edmonton from Winnipeg, when my mom picked me up, and the first place I wanted to stop said, "You need to take me to a 24-hour convenience store. I don't care which one it is. I need to go somewhere that's open 24 hours because I need a Slurpee." That was sort of, I was glad to be back. I definitely, at that point in time, I didn't really think I had any real issues. Most of my realizations of, my behavior and things that went on are looking back in hindsight with, a more mature outlook and greater understanding of myself and whatnot. At that point in time, it really didn't seem like a big deal. It didn't seem like there was, anything to be worried about. I do know, after I got back, I got back in October, I literally was back at work at my old job, driving working heavy equipment for the mobile gravel crushing company by the 14th of October. I was back working. I think what in hindsight should have been the first indication that things were not all well were, of course, you're working in a gravel pit. You got to leave paved areas to get to them. And my first trip out to the crusher was, I turn off the main highway onto a gravel road. I get down about 300 meters and I freeze. And I literally had to sit there for about half an hour going, holy fuck, there are no mines. You can drive. It's all safe. So that was, once that was done, once I got worked through that, it didn't really enter my head, and I just kind of moved on, and didn't really. At that point in time, I didn't think that. Well, makes sense, right? You spend 6 months worrying about mines and everything else that, of course, not going to adjust to, rural Canada, rural Alberta in a heartbeat. So I didn't really think anything of it, and so I just kind of went on with my business, and didn't do anything about it. So it was, and probably a lot of that was stupid male pride. It's just, there's nothing wrong. I can deal with this. Not a big deal. Just move on. This is sort of what you got to deal with. So just fight your way through it. So I did.
Once you talked yourself into driving on the gravel roads and stuff, like what else were you thinking or doing that looking back was, should have been a cause for concern?
Well, doing a threat analysis, no matter where I am, going through an urban area, driving through the country, just, what most people look at and go, wow, this is beautiful scenery. I drove through the country going, yeah, okay, well, there could be bad guys there. There could be an ambush site there. It was, honestly, it wasn't anything that really, I thought was strange. I didn't think that was per se abnormal. And it honestly didn't. It should have been a trigger. It should have been something. Go, hey, you know what? This isn't really normal. Like, normal people don't do this. People who are stable don't wander around and view their entire environment as a potential combat zone. They don't do that. Like, that is not a normal thought process when you're not in a war zone. That was the part that I didn't pick up on, that was maybe a natural outcome of the last 6 months of my life, and so it didn't really tweak on me that was an issue.
What about relations with other people, friends, family?
Well, for the most part, I mean, relationships with my friends didn't overly change. I mean, I've never been a person that really has a large circle of friends. It's been, you know, and even now, my circle of friends from back then is pretty much my circle of friends now. There's been a few additions, but I've never really been. I have lots of acquaintances and people that, you know, I associate with and whatnot, but, you know, people that I actually am willing to spend an extra amount of my life with and time with has always been very small, and for the most part, it remains the same now as it did back then. So, I mean, since I haven't driven them all off, obviously, I think things have gone pretty well. Either that, or they're just a little messed up like I am.
So what about that? How much contact did you have when you came back with other guys you'd served with who would understand what you're doing?
Honestly, it was fairly minimal for a fair number of years. There were a few here in Calgary that I kept into contact with, you know, by either, at that point in time, letter. I mean, nowadays it's email and texting and whatnot, but back then it was letter and telephone calls. But outside of that, I was I was at that time, I was part of 78 Field Battery in Red Deer, and there was only a SIGs unit, and nobody there had deployed with me. So, you know, I'd have to go to Edmonton or Calgary to associate with guys that I deployed with. It helped that one of the sergeants in the battery, he was on Op Harmony Rota 1, so we actually replaced them when we got there. So, I mean, I had someone I could talk to and associate with that, you know, kind of got it. I mean, yeah, he had different experiences on his tour, but, you know, I mean, pretty much it wasn't like I was, got out of the Army as soon as I got back and moved to some small rural community where, you know, nobody even knew that I was in the military. So I wasn't completely at loose ends, you know, to a certain degree. Much later on, probably, I would say probably about 15 years or so after the tour, so in mid 2000s, we actually, a bunch of us decided, you know, we're going to have a company reunion, and so we put together a company reunion in, I think it was 2007, that I hosted down at the Junior Ranks Mess in Red Deer, and we, you know, kind of got as many people. It was sort of last minute, and we didn't quite plan it out as well as we should have, you know, to get the largest number of people, but we did get quite a, you know, I think there was 18 or 19 people that could make it. You know, and at that point in time, there were still quite a few guys that we'd served with that were still in. So, I mean, a lot of it was, yeah, they're in Afghanistan, or they're on pre-training for Afghanistan, you know, and that sort of thing. So they, you know, honestly weren't available to show up. But at that point in time, I think now there's very few people from a company that I don't actually know where they are and what they're up to. Facebook's a wonderful thing. It's you know, allowed us to make and maintain contact over the long term. So that's been that's been very good, because it's, you know, I mean, it was a significant period of my life, and I want to keep contact with those guys.
Looking back, and how do you wish that you had been reintegrated when you came back? What do you think would have made a difference?
Probably with reintegration, I mean, at least if it had been, you know, I mean, we didn't have to go to any, you know, go to Cyprus or some other warm place and, you know, have a holiday or whatever else. But it would have been, you know, kind of nice to have come back, stayed with the battalion for a while, you know, get back into a normal swing or normal routine, you know, with a bunch of people that you're comfortable with, prior to being cut loose. I mean, basically it was, and I don't blame anything on the battalion for this. This was just, I think this was just, you know, it was the Army culture at the time. It was, you know, what they understood, had to be done or needed to be done, or it wasn't done through any nefarious plan. Let's get rid of these guys. It was just, yeah, okay, your tour's done, and whether it's a budgetary thing or whatever, I don't know, but honestly, I don't think it was anyone's pre-plan to create the amount of difficulty that actually did. It was just sort of, the result of the time. I mean, from what they learned from those tours, definitely helped out, the guys going to Afghanistan and that sort of stuff. It was definitely, they learned quite a bit of what not to do, or at least a better way of doing things. So, I mean, probably, if at the bare minimum they had done was, okay, the battalion's back, you're gonna be here for the next month. We got a bunch of admin stuff to sort out. We've got a bunch of, all this other stuff to sort out, and we're gonna get you back at least to a normal battalion style life prior to sending everybody home. Probably would have helped quite a few guys, I'm thinking.
Do you have a sense, are we talking, the guys that maybe struggled a bit when they came back, do you think that they were more, was it more a reserve thing because they were scattered to the four winds, or was it reserve and regs?
I wouldn't say, I would say probably it was, and I don't really have much to go on other than, what I know from being in contact with people was, I think it was the people that suffered or had the biggest difficulties were the reservists per se, because they, especially reservists who, came from a unit that maybe sent one guy. So we had, and then got sent back. Like we deployed with a guy, I believe it was a Rocky Mountain Ranger, the only guy from his unit that went. When he was back, he went back to his home unit, and and they're basically in the middle of nowhere. Who did he have to talk to? Right? I mean, so units that had sent more troops, like Calgary Highlanders. There's quite a few guys from the Calgary Highlanders. I mean, at least they went back to their unit, and at least they had each other. And it was less of an issue in the larger centers where, Edmonton or Calgary, where you may not have had anybody from your unit go, but there was a guy from the LERs who went, and, you had something, your guys were working out of the same building, you had at least someone you could, shoot the shit with in the mess. I think probably it was a lot harder for guys who, were essentially sent off and really didn't have anyone else at least to talk to, who, had any kind of the same experiences. So I don't, for the most part, I'm not going to say there weren't guys in the regular force who didn't have big problems, because there probably were. It's PTSD is a very strange thing. Some people get greatly affected over what might be considered by most people insignificant, and other people don't. How they react, and it's one of those things that's very, very individual. I mean, there's no rule book.
So when you look back on your 6 months or so overseas, is there an incident that stands out for you, a memory that, good or bad? That
well, I mean, there's one thing I found that's very strange is everybody remembers different things. I mean, I keep in contact with a lot of the guys from A Company on a fairly regular basis. And every once in a while we'll sit down for a few drinks and get to some storytelling stuff. And someone will tell a story, and I'll be like, I don't remember that happening. I was there. Like, I was at that, I was there at that time, and I don't remember that. Or I'll tell a story, and someone was like, and they were there because I clearly remember them being there. They have no recollection. So it's things that you remember, and good or bad. I mean, I find it myself. I just find it very interesting what people remember, and whether or not whether they choose to remember it, or whether or not how memory works and that sort of stuff is, I just find kind of really interesting. I don't know. I mean, for memories, I mean, some of my good memories were just going on leave. And going off to the Leaf Center and actually just getting away for 72 hours. One thing that really stands out was when, and I'm not sure the background of how this happened, but it was one afternoon, the platoon commander, the company's, the platoon warrant, and the section commanders all kind of disappeared for the day. And next thing you know, my section, and I can't remember which other sections were with us, we got sent over to the Serb side of Pakrak to an area on the outskirts of town, and show up and there's a big hole in the driveway, and they were exhuming bodies that were buried in the driveway. And this was a group of 4 people that had been killed during the fighting. And my understanding from what I know is that essentially they were sitting in their living room, and some guys showed up, threw a bunch of grenades into the living room, and then machine gun what was left, and then dug a hole in the driveway and threw them in there. And so we were repatriating the bodies over to the Croatian side. We showed up there and loaded the body bags into the truck, and then had to fill in this big hole. That was probably the first close encounter that I had with atrocities per se. These were non-combatants. They were a couple. One of the couples was in their mid-60s, so elderly. No reason for them to be killed, but they were. And then the manner in which they were disposed of. I don't know where the information, because there was some UNCIV pole officers there taking evidence, pictures, and everything else. So I'm assuming looking back, that most likely that all went into a report and got sent to The Hague or whatever for some type of investigation. And I know there was quite a few investigations into ethnic cleansing and whatnot in Yugoslavia, but that's definitely a memory of that day that is extremely vivid and really hasn't changed. That's why I really can't stand the smell of pig barns and sour milk, because that combination of those two smells is pretty much what a decaying human body smells like.
What was the hardest part of being in a blue helmet between the Serbs and the Croats in this conflict?
I think probably the hardest part was seeing things that we could do that would make things better, but we weren't allowed to. We did tons of patrols through the area. You get to know which families are, you can tell in which areas you run into, which families are doing very poorly, no food and things like that. And you see these UNHCR convoys running through, and they're loaded to the gills with food and everything, and they're going to go somewhere, and and they're driving through your town, but they never stop. Things like that. That was probably, it was a little bit hard to stomach. I mean, there's, obviously there's a bigger picture, but honestly, at the end of the day, the bigger picture is, why are you there if you're not there to help? I mean, yeah, sure, we're stopping them from killing each other, but what good is that if they starve to death? So questions like that. Questions like that, situations like that actually, when I got back, why I changed my major in university to political science. Well, I wanted to delve into those questions as to why do governments make those decisions? What pushes the thought process, to, change one bad situation for another situation, and why is it better?
Can we go back to your a happy memory, going to the Leave Center? So what was that like, leaving this conflict area for 72 hours? Like, where did you go and what did you do?
Well, I actually I made it to 2 different leave centers. The first one was in Opatia, in Croatia, which is right on the Adriatic. Nice, quaint little, well, I'm not even sure if it's a town, I'm not even sure what size it is. But it was at one point in time, it probably is again, it's sort of a holiday resort. So you've got all these really nice hotels right along the Adriatic. You could get fresh seafood. Nightlife per se wasn't much. It's not like we were looking to go clubbing or anything like that. But it was, there was, you could sit on the beach. You could go sit in the pool in the hotel. You had great food. Go to the restaurants. The inflationary rate there was so huge. If I remember correctly, when we got there, the inflation rate was 3,000%, and by the time we left, it was 30,000%. We were getting paid in Deutschmarks, so for us to go out and have a good time in the Leave Center didn't really cost us a lot of money because our money went far, so we spent it. That was probably that was a really good time. My understanding was we moved the Leave Center from there to Balaton Lake in Hungary, mainly because the Croatian army was turning Opatia into a Leave Center, and they really didn't want potential incidents, which kind of makes sense. So they set up a new Leave Center in Balaton Lake in Hungary, which was a very interesting town. It was originally, my understanding is, it was a Roman holiday center. There's some Roman baths in it. Balaton Lake is an extremely shallow lake that I think you can walk all the way through and it never gets above your waist. So there's hot springs in the area. And it definitely was quite a bit different than Opatia in that it basically had a nightlife that never shut down. The bars ran 24 hours a day. They shut down there a couple hours here and there on a rotating basis so they could restock and clean up. But it was definitely different than Opatia, and it was still fairly relaxing. I really don't know if it was a really good idea to send a bunch of guys somewhere where they could get liquored up, though, to the extent we did. But it was. I won't say it was surreal, but it was a break, but not really. Like you got away, but you didn't, because I remember in Balaton Lake, I think it was the second night we were there. We'd been out and I'd finally had enough, so it was about 3 o'clock in the morning and I made it back to the hotel somehow. And thought it would be a really good idea to write a letter to one of my friends, so I did, in this drunken state. And about 5 years ago, my buddy dug it out and I read it again. And all I could think of was reading is, there's something seriously wrong with this guy. Like, this guy has got some issues. So it was definitely a lot of fun. Like, it was a great way to blow off steam without having to, and I honestly don't think there really was a lot of issues that we had at all in any of the Leave Centers. Not to my recollection anyways. I don't know of anyone ever getting into any major problems, so.
What would you do when you weren't at the Leave Center? How would you blow off steam, or what was the alcohol policy when you're actually in?
Honestly, the alcohol policy that we had per se, was, the company commander was, well, you know what, drink what you want, be responsible, but if I bug you out and you're not in the tracks with your weapon and your web gear and all your kit, by the time we need to be going, you're going to jail. So basically, it was be an adult. You know what we're doing here. Don't get yourself to the point where you can't function if you have to, and do what and just relax, blow off some steam. We had we had a weight pit with a fair number of gym equipment. So, if you weren't sleeping, eating, on patrol, doing an OP or various other track maintenance or whatever else. I mean, there was, we had a canteen during the working hours. You know, I mean, guys weren't sitting around at 7 o'clock in the morning getting wasted or having a beer. I mean, you were working. But, you know, on your off time, I worked out quite a bit. Kept you know, one way to burn off some energy when you have excess.
So how effective was that policy, do you think?
Well, honestly, since I think in our entire tour we had only one alcohol-related incident, and that was after, that was when we were in Sector South, and it was right before we deployed back home. I think it was, I think it was a very sound policy. I mean, you know, we'll treat them like adults, and they'll act like adults, and you know, if they're going to give you the rope to hang yourself, you're going to prove that they don't need to. You know, I don't think we had any significant issues with it.
You've kind of talked about, you know, some of the effects, you know, good and bad. But if you were to sort of wrap it up, how did this experience when you're in your 20s change you as a person, change you as a soldier?
Well, one, I mean, as a soldier per se, I think it really drilled home the importance of teamwork, the importance of knowing your job, the importance of knowing the job of the people around you, and really gave me a greater understanding of, you know, a good sound building blocks for later on in my career when I became a senior NCO, to understanding you know, I think one of the maxims they say is amateur study tactics and professional study logistics. You know, understanding that, yeah, the guys in the pointy end of the stick, they're real important because the tail is there to support them. But if you don't have the tail, the guys on the pointy end, they're going to be useful for only a very small period of time. So a greater understanding of the importance of all arms cooperation and that kind of thing. I think it really gave me a nice starting building block for it. You know, and a greater appreciation for the various trades and what they actually do. Having, you know, getting a chance to work a bit with the engineers, getting a chance to work with the logs, you know, getting a chance to work with, you know, even bin rats and whatnot, and learning the various ins and outs and whatnot, I think set me on a learning path. I mean, I didn't learn a whole heck of a lot, but I learned that everybody, you know, every trade has an important function. That's why they have the trade. If it didn't serve a function, we wouldn't have it. So it definitely motivated me to learn more and more about what everybody does, and not just what I do in my trade. You know, I mean, it gave me a greater appreciation for, you know, the amount of work. You know, one thing that I found, you know, you look up and you see, you know, when you're a private, you see the sergeants and the warrants and the officers and whatnot, and you go, wow, man, I can't wait to be one of them. They don't do anything. Well, you know, the further along you go, you find out you actually have more work, and you get less sleep. I mean, you know, some days you wake up and you wish, man, I wish I was back being a bomber. It's the best rank in the Army. You know, you're high enough rank, they put you in charge of something, but if it goes sideways, it's not your fault because you're just a bomber. You know, it definitely, I learned that there was a greater appreciation for you know, the amount of work that goes into training, the amount of work that goes into maintaining your skill set, and the importance of doing that.
Conversely, do you have any regrets about that, going on that tour?
No, actually, I have zero regret about going on that tour. You know, I didn't go on it for any specific, you know, I didn't have any ulterior motives for going on it outside of the fact that, you know, it was, you know, I'm in the Army, I signed up to do this, they're looking for guys, and I honestly can't say I have anything better I need to be doing right now. You know, this is, you know, one of the reasons why I joined was to do stuff like this. And so I have zero regrets per se. I mean, I won't really call it a regret, but we were essentially offered direct entry contracts when we were done. And I think back and go, what would my life be if I'd said yes? Where would I be? I don't regret not taking it because I'm perfectly happy with the way my life turned out. But it's definitely one of those things that, what if? If I'd done that, what would my life look like? Where would I be now? Having a couple conversations with some of the guys who were in the battalion in the regular force, and talking to them, because I did my leadership course the next summer of '94 in Wainwright, and of course all the guys from the 2nd Battalion, they're all staff in Wainwright that summer. So I ran into quite a few of them there, and just listened to some of their stories from the previous winter of exercising out in Shiloh and talking about the new batch that just got out of battle school. I'm like, man, I sure missed you guys. I took some guys back. I took a bunch of these guys back to the CQ and said, I'm turning these in. I broke them. Things like that. So it, we were. It was nice to know that we weren't just a bunch of guys that showed up and weren't appreciated while we were there, and we were missed when we were gone. So that was kind of nice. That was definitely part of the experience, part of what I take away from there that I won't give up or wouldn't give up.
What do you think? Where would you be now if you had taken that offer?
Honestly, I would have been out of the Army in 2007 for sure. At what rank, I'm not sure, but definitely not a Chief Warrant Officer. Mainly, well, I won't go that far, but I mean, I probably wouldn't have been one. I would have been out in '07 because I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. I'm currently still serving on a permanent category. But in '07, if that had come down, I mean, I work in the civilian world with a couple of ex-regular force guys who were released for exactly the same reason. So I know my career would have been done, almost 10 years ago if I'd stayed in. I'm sure I would have had quite a few more tours if I'd stayed in. But other than that, I don't know. I have no idea. I know I probably would have tried to stay with the battalion. I would have been, maybe not with the 2nd Battalion, but it might have been moved to the 1st or the 3rd. Don't know. But I would have been a civilian by '07, and then who knows? Who knows where I would be now?
What about other tours? Have you tried to go overseas again?
I was dagging for Task Force 108 when they dagged me red because my medical condition, they put me on a category. And I fought that because honestly, to this day, I still don't, I really don't think it's that big of a deal, but in the Army's estimation it is, I guess. So yeah.
Is there anything, just to wrap it up, anything that you want to say or talk about that we haven't discussed?
No, I don't really think so. I mean, it's I've been in for now, on my 27th year now, and I've seen a lot of guys come in, a lot of people come into the Army, into the reserves. A lot of them staying for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And it's. I honestly would. I would encourage anyone to join. One, I mean, even if it's not for you, even if you come in, you do your basic training, and after a year or two you decide you don't like it. What I think people can take away from the experience, for the most part, is things that will stand them in good stead out in the civilian world. I think it makes people greater citizens, gives them more of an understanding of the importance of living in a democracy, and the whole understanding of the social contract, because they've entered and been part of a very select fraternity or a select group organization. Can't really call it fraternity anymore because we've got all genders. So it's definitely a select group of individuals and people who, serve and make a specific contribution that maybe not everyone is capable of doing. Whether it's emotionally, intellectually, physically, or for whatever reason, or it's just not their bag, they're not interested in it. And I think it gives, most people, most soldiers, former soldiers that I've talked to, they don't miss an election. They vote. They take part. Why? Because they understand the importance of, your civic responsibility. It's sort of ingrained. Not only do we get all these nice things from living in a democracy, we also have, as citizens, we have responsibilities. And one of them is to be involved. And I think that is, in the reserves, that's one thing that you actually learn quite a bit about. It's because you live and work a sort of a dual existence. You're a civilian, but you're not. You go to your regular day job, 9 to 5 or whatever it is, and you work with regular civilians, and then you moonlight. You moonlight as as a serving member of the armed forces, and so you get to see both sides of the world at the same time. Whereas in regular force people, for the most part, they don't unless they've previously been a reservist, and there are quite a few of those. They don't really get to see that duality. So you go to work and you talk about current events with all your civilian friends, and you have their perspective, and then you go to the armories and shop talk what's happening around the world, because honestly we pay attention to that because you never know where you could end up getting sent. So you keep track of that, and you kind of see the two different worlds and how they mesh together. So I definitely myself, I encourage people, young guys at work, young girls at work, that when they come down, because I work for federal correction, so we're getting a lot of mid-20s employees coming into the workforce, and some of them, expressed interest in joining the reserves. I'm like, you bet. Like, you can't not gain something from it. You're going to gain either intellectually, or you're going to gain a sense of self-confidence, or maybe you're just going to gain a skill set that you've never even dreamed of having. And you're going to learn a lot about yourself as a human being, which at the end of the day you're going to take out there, and that's going to help prove every other aspect of your life.
I do have one last question that occurred to me while you were talking, because now that you're one of the senior guys that doesn't have a whole lot of work to do, how do you think, when you look at the younger soldiers in the guns or in Red Deer that served in Afghanistan, how do you think they're doing back home relative to your generation coming back from Croatia and Bosnia?
Honestly, I actually think they're doing a lot better. Maybe not in having issues, because there are a number of them, and I've talked to a number of them who have been having issues, and but the understanding of that you may have issues and that the resources are there is much greater. They know that for the most part. Some of them it takes a little longer than others to convince them that they need to go to get help, or at least someone to talk to. They're back in the early 90s, it was just shut up and soldier on. That was the mentality. Good, bad, or indifferent, that's just what it was, and you did. It wasn't what can we do for you? It's what have you done for us lately? The attitudes have changed quite a bit since then, and with dealing with operational stress injuries and that sort of thing, having the support system, and then being being able to provide necessary resources. You know, it's such, I won't say it make it easier for them, but because I mean, dealing with that, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge if you're having a problem. You have to acknowledge it, and you have to get help. If you're not willing to, you're no better off now than you were 20, 50, 100 years ago. I think now there's a greater understanding and acceptance that, you know what, we send people off, they do bad things, they see bad things, and it affects them. And part of what we should be doing is helping them learn to either cope, deal, or get better. And I think, for the most part, I think we're, you know, definitely moving in the right direction. And, you know, is it perfect? No. No system's perfect. Do we learn from everything that happens? Yes, we do. And, you know, constantly reevaluating the programs and what's going on is necessary to ensure that we're, you know, staying progressive, staying on top of the issues. I mean, we've deployed a lot of people in the last 15 years. And we're not even, right now, we're seeing the issues from, I mean, from what I see from the PTSD from Yugoslavia is guys who are going to have problems right away did. And then you have the people that 20 to 25 years later, finally, you know, one thing happens too much and they crash. So right now we're seeing a precursor of what's going to happen in 20 years. And we need to, you know, I mean, having these programs and working right now, getting them better, finding out what works, what doesn't work, being proactive and being flexible in dealing with these issues is going to be very important now, because 20 years from now, we're going to see a greater number.
That's great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.